Hello, everybody, and welcome to Crisis and Hope, YU Voices, our latest installment. Crisis and Hope is a project of the Center for Israel Studies and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs and Judaic Studies at YU Madei Hayahadut. My name is Jess Olson. I'm an associate professor of Jewish history here at Yeshiva. And today we are going to be engaged in a timely and challenging conversation. When we began this series in June, we had in mind creating a forum that would go beyond the headlines and the tweets and the talking points that often pass for political and cultural discourse. We wanted a space for nuance, depth, and perspective. We believe that the past can inform and bring light to the present and give us hope in moments of confusion and despair, of which we've been having plenty these days. For that reason, I'm so honored to invite my friends and colleagues and all of you here today. The title of our subject today is Anti-Semitic and Anti-Black Violence, Ukraine and Oklahoma, 1921. Obviously, the question of mass violence, the question of all of the disorder rooted in the history of both societies has become, ever more obvious today, especially over the events of the last week. The wounds are still very raw. And so I think this is really an opportune time to look back at history, at our history, at the history of violence, political violence, targeted towards racial minorities. And that will be what we look at today. To discuss this topic, I'm very, very excited to have two experts in the field. On the one hand, we have Professor Scott Ellsworth from the University of Michigan, a PEN Book Award winner, writer and historian. He's the author of Death in a Promised Land, the first comprehensive history of the Tulsa Race Massacre. He currently serves as the chair of the Physical Investigation Committee 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial, which uncovered a mass grave in Tulsa this past October. Some of you may have seen that. It was actually covered in the media. I remember seeing that. Scott teaches in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and his forthcoming book, The Groundbreaking, An American City and Its Search for Justice, comes out on May 18th of this year. Our other guest is Professor Elissa Bemporad, Professor of History and the Unger Chair in East European Jewish History at the Holocaust at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's a two-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award. She's the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experience in Minsk, and Legacy of Blood, her most recent book, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets, which came out in 2019. Elissa is the co-editor of two volumes, Women in Genocide, Survivors, Victims, and Perpetrators, and Pogroms, A Documentary History. She's the editor of Jewish Social Studies, an editor of Jewish Social Studies, and is currently working on a biography of Esther Frumkin. So I want to thank you both for being with us today. As you can see, we have a very distinguished panel. So I guess what we're going to do here first is we're going to start with both Professor Bemporad and Professor Ellsworth, giving a bit of a background as to the work they've been doing and their thoughts on today's topic. And so we will begin with my friend Elissa, with Professor Bemporad, who will take the first go.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you to the Judaic Studies program at YU, Kol HaKavod, for organizing this. I'm really thrilled to be here. So let me begin by giving you a sense of the context, the political and military context that led to an intense wave of anti-Jewish violence and of anti-Semitism, which I have studied recently in the book that I just wrote. And so the context, but then also I will focus on the nature of this violence and the nature of anti-Semitism. So in terms of context, during the Russian Civil War from 1917 until 1921, between 1,500 and 2,000 pogroms took place in more than 900 cities, towns, villages throughout Ukraine, Belarus, southern Russia. The epicenter was Ukraine. Most places experienced more than one pogrom, so you have an escalation of violence. As many as 200,000 Jews perished, from injuries sustained during, the conflict, because of disease, starvation, exposure, or because they were, murdered in cold blood. 300,000 Jewish children were orphaned. Hundreds of thousands were wounded, permanently disfigured. Thousands of women were raped. Perhaps as many as 1 in 12 Jewish women and girls were raped in Ukraine alone. And Jewish property was looted and destroyed in its entirety. So this history, in a way, reshaped the demography of European Jews. Hundreds of thousands of Jews moved away from the territory of the former Pale of Settlement, where these instances of violence took place. And these instances also traumatized the affected communities for a generation. This history, this trauma, is largely forgotten. It is overshadowed by the Holocaust, which took place some 20 years later in the same territories, right? The epicenter of the Holocaust also was Ukraine. So just very briefly to give you a sense in terms of the context, military and political context, you have a military conflict that begins after the October Revolution of 1917. It is a conflict between the Red Army, which is fighting on behalf of Bolshevik forces on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the White Army, which is fighting for the reinstatement of the Tsar and the return to monarchism. You have Ukrainian nationalist forces led by the Petlura's Directory, who are striving to gain control over the southwestern region of the former Russian Empire. They want an independent Ukraine. You have the Polish army, which is fighting in the context of a bloody Polish-Soviet war. And then you have a diverse group of anarchist peasant bands, not always fighting on behalf of any ideology, but largely speaking, anti-Bolshevik. So this is real chaos, right? It's very hard to follow what is happening, and you have one army occupying one town, leaving after 2 weeks. The town is occupied by another army, and so on. Some towns, some Städtlach are occupied more than 8-9 times, and again, you have an escalation of violence. The pogroms of the Civil War are very different from the pogroms that we are more familiar with in terms of Jewish historical memory. The wave of the anti-Jewish violence of 1881, 1882, that every single book in modern Jewish history mentions as a turning point, right? Or Kishinev, 1903, or the pogroms of 1905. These pogroms are different. They were carried out in military fashion, but they're also different because they take place in the aftermath of World War I, the war to end all wars, in the midst of new forms of extreme violence that in a way reduces the inhibition to kill and witness murder, and also shows new ways of deploying propaganda to dehumanize the enemy. This is a time when murdering and plundering become socially acceptable. The key words, I think, in order to understand this, the condition of Jews and, in a way, anti-Jewish sentiment, are loyalty and allegiance, right? Already during World War I, as we know, the loyalties of thousands of Jewish communities on the Eastern Front were tested by different armies that were involved in the conflict. Jews were identified as the dangerous enemy aliens by the Russian Imperial Army, and they're accused of spying on behalf of the German army. They face expulsions, deportations, looting, and rape. During the Civil War, you have other allegiances at stake. Jews are caught up in the crossfire of these new allegiances and become again an easy target for violence. They are seen as the interloper in the different national bodies that are in danger during the war. They are seen as the force that is tearing at the heart of the nation's fabric, of Russia. The Russian Empire just collapsed, of the newly independent Poland that just came into being, of Ukraine that is striving for independence. And of course, what is the greatest danger here? It's Bolshevism. And regardless of their actual choice in the imagination of many Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians, Jews become the vectors for spreading communism. So in a way, we cannot understand anti-Semitism in this context without understanding the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. In most Jewish settlements, the pogroms typically coincide with a power vacuum, which is left by the crumbling of state power, which aggravated the vulnerability of Jews. You have widespread reports and rumors of alleged Jewish disloyalty toward Ukraine and Poland, and allegiance to the Bolsheviks. And one of the rumors about the Bolsheviks' intention to launch an uprising led by Jewish socialists becomes very widespread. Just one thing that I wanted to mention, in many ways, this is also a continuation of a trope that predates 1917, of course, that identifies Jews with the revolutionary movement. Of course, the fact that Leon Trotsky, who never identified as a Jew, but was of Jewish background, is the leader of the Red Army, does not play in the Jews' favor. The fact, moreover, that in 1918, Jews quickly established self-defense units to protect the communities further intensified this no-win situation. So in a way, their assertiveness is perceived as a provocation, as a sign of, again, potential disloyalty of a minority group that refuses to behave obediently and submissively, and which can therefore expect revenge and punishment in the form of pogroms. And so in a way, the troops, Ukrainian, white, or Polish, attempt to restore their moral order by punishing Jews for allegedly breaking out of social norms that they considered standard for a minority. Of course, what further complicates things is that if initially most Jews and Jewish parties oppose the Bolshevik forces, overwhelming majority of Jews is anti-Bolshevik. This is why we must say the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. However, the accelerated intensity of the violence against them, the violence that turns genocidal, eventually sways them into seeking protection from the Red Army. Now, Red Army soldiers were not immune to perpetrating atrocities against Jews, of course, but they did condemn the pogroms that were committed by their own forces, something that Ukrainian and Polish troops did not always do. And moreover, again, what complicates further is that Lenin himself outlaws pogroms in 1918. He says, no, this is no longer acceptable. So Jews, in a way, choose the Bolsheviks as the lesser of two evils, because, you know, the Red Army is killing less Jews or stops killing them altogether. Let me just finish by zooming in on one instance of violence, which also gives us a sense of where we are in terms of the memory of these pogroms. This is the single deadliest episode of violence during the Civil War. It took place in a town by the name of Praskuriv in Ukrainian. On Saturday, February 15, 1919, Ukrainian soldiers murdered 1,600 Jewish civilians in less than 3 hours. Calls to liquidate the entire Jewish population of the town, killing everyone from the youngest to the oldest, became widespread at the time of the occupation of the town. Let me just read to you the words of one survivor, and then I will finish. It is impossible to imagine what happened here on February 15th. This was not a pogrom. It was like the Armenian slaughter. So deeming the violence unlike all previous waves of anti-Jewish pogroms, the witness could only compare it to the Armenian genocide. Of course, the term genocide had not been coined yet, but there was extensive information. The information was available about the systematic extermination of Armenians at the hands of the Young Turks. He further says, the witness, I do not have the strength to describe the details of the slaughter. Simply remembering it makes me lose my mind. This slaughter surpassed the violence of the pogroms ever experienced by Jews. So it's a different kind of pogrom. It is a military pogrom, but it has extensive participation of neighbors that we can talk about later. The motivation is multifaceted, and I can talk about it later. I just wanted to say that it also builds on traditional anti-Semitism, but it also builds on a more modern version of anti-Semitism, whereby Jews are identified as a racial enemy. And let me finish here.
Sorry, sorry about that.
Oh, okay. I thought, did I do something wrong?
A bit of a computer glitch. Thank you very much, Elissa. We're live. This is the thrill of live production. Elissa, thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Scott, Professor Ellsworth.
Thank you, Elissa. That was really terrific. I hope I can live up to it. You all are, and I'm thrilled to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. As everyone here is aware, there is a long history of racial violence in the United States, particularly against African Americans. But it's worth remembering that the last decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century were especially perilous times for Black Americans. This is, of course, the time of, lynching is rife. It's rife throughout the country. And the lynchings themselves, although the numbers weren't as high as they were in the 1890s, they become more and more brutal. African Americans accused of trumped up crimes are burned at the stake, tortured ahead of time, on and on and on in these gigantic public displays. This is a time of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the second Ku Klux Klan that comes into being in 1915. Not only is it anti-Black, but it's also anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic as well too. It's going to become a huge force in Oklahoma. Birth of a Nation is of this era, and scientific racism is taught in every Ivy League school, every major public university in the United States. This is just all a part of it. There's very much a militant white racism, and the era is also distinguished, particularly in the World War I years, by what were then called race riots, and the term is under attack at the moment. But these were often characterized by some sort of a racial incident involving Black people and white people that grows into white mobs assaulting African Americans, invading Black communities, looting, killing, burning. And in the face of this, there is a renewed African American determination to fight back. Certainly after the experience of Black troops serving in the American Army during World War I, being treated with much more respect in France and coming back to the United States and being prepared to, fight to the death to prepare, to defend their communities. Now, these feelings were all very much a part of Oklahoma and kind of heightened there. Oklahoma, I think it's important to remember, has only been a state since 1907. It had previously been Indian territory. And there's a long history of African Americans in Oklahoma, beginning with African American slaves that came with the tribes during the removal and the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Prior to the Civil War, if you were a slave in Texas or in Arkansas, you tried to run away to Indian territory because you're going to get treated better. There was an effort to turn Oklahoma into an all-Black state in the late years of the 19th century. And there were many African Americans who came to Oklahoma when the state was opened up, really as a way to get the boot of Southern racism off of their throats. This was a place to, we're going to fight against it. This is where we're going to make our last stands. This is where we're going to live freely. Now, Tulsa itself was the boom town of boom towns. In the year 1900, there were less than 1,000 people lived in Tulsa. It was a dusty Muskogee Creek Indian and cowboy town. A couple of years after the turn of the century, a major oil discovery is found right outside of Tulsa. It is the most productive small-scale oil field in the world, and Tulsa becomes the oil capital of the world for a period. So by 1920, less than 20 years after this discovery, Tulsa has 100,000 people, 25-story skyscrapers, streetcars, movie theaters, mansions, the works. It is a full-fledged city. And there's great wealth in Tulsa because so many people are making money off of of the oil industry. This is where J. Paul Getty gets his start. Lots of, American millionaires made a lot of money in Tulsa. And this money also flows to the African American community. So most Black Tulsans lived in a neighborhood called Greenwood, named after Greenwood, Mississippi, where many had immigrated from. Blacks were not, however, allowed to work in the oil industry. So unlike in Chicago and other places where there was competition between whites and blacks for jobs, that didn't exist. Black people in Tulsa had jobs that Black people were allowed to have. They worked as maids, as servants in witch-right houses, ditch diggers, dishwashers, janitors, all of that. But you had this population, because there was so much money, who went and worked in the white community during the week, and they brought home a paycheck every week. Well, they don't spend that paycheck in white businesses downtown where there are Jim Crow laws and, racial insults and all that, and instead support a group of Black merchants. So what happens is the merchant class in Tulsa has this wonderful captive consumer audience, and they do superbly. A family, I interviewed their son in the 1970s, the Williams family, John and Lula Williams. They owned the Dreamland movie theater, which was a motion picture and vaudeville theater that seated 300 people. They owned their own automotive garage. Lula Williams had a confectionery, an ice cream and candy store. They had a 3-story brick Williams building where the confectionery was on the first floor. They rented offices to Black doctors and lawyers on the second floor. On the third floor, the family had their apartment. So you had this while most people in most African Americans in Greenwood live in shanties without, indoor plumbing or electricity, you did have this small group that did quite well. Okay. All right. Now, Tulsa as well is a very lawless town. It's a boom town. There's a lot of money, a lot of gambling, all of that. In fact, auto theft was so prevalent in Tulsa that New York-based insurance companies would not sell automobile insurance because things were being stolen all the time. So there's a lot of crime going on, a lot of violence going on as well too. And there's a very important crime that happens in 1920. An 18-year-old white telephone worker named Roy Belton sticks up a white cab driver in Tulsa outside of the city, robs him, then shoots the cab driver in the stomach, kicks him out onto the highway to die, steals the cab. Well, the cab driver lingers on for 3 or 4 days. And this crime is splashed all over as this horrific, terrible murder, all of that. Belton is apprehended. He's brought in front of the cab driver who identifies him. There's a newspaper campaign against this crime. This is the most dastardly act that's happened in Tulsa. On and on and on. There's a sense that Belton is going to escape by an insanity plea, and the cab driver dies. And shortly after he dies, and it's reported in the newspaper, a lynch mob, all whites, everyone's white involved in this story, gathers outside of the courthouse in whose top floor jail this young accused murderer is being held. Finally, a group of the mob, they steal the taxi cab from the police impoundment lot where it had been held. They bring it there. They put masks over their faces and go with the guns, go up to the sheriff and demand the prisoner, and the sheriff turns them over. So the Tulsa police force, meanwhile, is nowhere to be seen. The mob then drives in this line of cars, hundreds of people. They said it was a 3-mile line of cars out to where the murder took place out in the country. Roy Belton is lynched. The Tulsa police finally show up and they direct traffic so everybody can get home okay. In that week, all of the city fathers in Tulsa praise the lynching. The mayor does, the editor of the white newspapers. This is a good thing that happened. It shows the lawless element that the law-abiding citizens of Tulsa are not going to put up with any of this. The only voice against it is the Tulsa Star, Tulsa's black newspaper, which goes out against the lynching and also says this explodes the theory that a prisoner is safe on the top floor of the courthouse. Okay, so moving quickly along, 1 year later, on May 30th, 1921, there was an incident involving a 19-year-old African-American shoe shiner and a 16 or 17-year-old white elevator operator. The shoe shiner named Dick Rowland worked in a shine parlor that was white owned and white patronized, but there were no toilet facilities for the shoe shiners. So the owner arranged for Roland to go down the block, to ride in an elevator to the top floor of the Drexel building, to use the colored restroom that was there and come back. So this was something he and his workmates did every day. Well, something happens on that Monday. We think what happened is that, in those days, elevators had elevator operators. You had to, use a wheel to do it. It was hard to get the levels right. Apparently the elevator there was very persnickety. We think that Dick Rowland tripped as he walked in the elevator, reached his hands out, grabbed the young woman whose name was Sarah Page's dress, tore it. She screams, he leaves and runs out. There's been a lot of mythology, whether they were having a clandestine affair, all of this stuff. But anyway, the police are summoned, but they don't seem to be particularly worried about this. They don't put out an all points bulletin. They write this stuff down. Meanwhile, a white clerk at Renberg's clothing store hears the scream, and he concludes that this was a rape attempt, and no question about it. And he'll tell that to anybody. Okay, so the next morning, Tuesday, May 31st, the police go and arrest Dick Rowland at his home, bring him down to the courthouse, put him in the jail on the top floor, to be arraigned, whatnot. But the Tulsa Tribune, which was the city's afternoon white newspaper, takes another handle on this. In their first edition that comes out at about 3:30, they have a front page article that says that a Negro who wouldn't give his name to the police but called himself Diamond Dick had been seen lurking up in the halls, that he went in, that he tore Sarah Page's dress, scratched her face, tried to rape her and all that. And then in an editorial that's now since been destroyed, but I interviewed a gentleman in 1975 who had read it. The editorial was entitled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And obviously we had the lynching of the white Roy Belton a year earlier. We're now going to lynch this guy. So the Tribune hits the street at about 3:30. Within a half hour, there's a lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. So as the hours go by, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, we have 100 whites, 200 whites, 300 whites, 400, 500 whites gathering. But we have a new sheriff. And this sheriff is determined to defend Dick Rowland. He disables the elevator in the courthouse, barricades the stairwells, puts his deputies on the roof with high-powered rifles. And when members of the lynch mob say, hand him over, he said, I'm not going to do it. So meanwhile, word hits Greenwood, the Black community, what's going on. African-American vets then take over. They shut down the theaters. They say, we're not going to let this happen here. Then at around 7:30 in the evening, 25 African-American vets, some of who've gone home to get their World War I uniforms and put on, get into cars, drive down to the courthouse where there's 500 whites waiting for this lynching to happen. The vets, and they're all armed. They present themselves. The sheriff said, we're here to help to protect the prisoner if you'd like us to. The sheriff says, no, get the hell out of here. They go away. The appearance of the black vets enrages the mob. They are now going to get armed. So they run home to get guns. They run and call others to come to the courthouse. A group of dozens or more attempt to break into the National Guard armory to steal the Springfield rifles that are there. They're prevented from doing so. But the mob continues to grow, 600, 700, 800. When are we going to do this thing? When's it going to happen? What if it was your daughter? On and on and on. They're enraged by this alleged interracial rape attempt. Then finally at around 10 o'clock at night, word hits Greenwood that whites are storming the jail. It's a false rumor. They are not. But this time, 75 African-American vets get into cars, all armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, go down to the courthouse, again present themselves to the sheriff, who again sends them away. As they're leaving, an elderly white man tries to disarm a black vet. A gun goes off, and the worst incident of racial violence in American history begins at that point. The mob now doesn't care about Dick Rowland. They're now out to get any African-American that they can. So there are several people, an unknown people, a number of people die initially at the courthouse. The black vets fight a retreating battle back to Greenwood. There aren't a lot of street lights. It's night. They're largely successful. Whites then start murdering African-Americans, janitors, people like that who are working downtown, getting off of work, have no idea what's going on. The Tulsa police force, meanwhile, now shows up. They've been absent. They then start deputizing members of the mob. Police officers also start to break into sporting goods stores and pawn shops and start handing out guns to mob members. And they tell them to get a gun and get an N-word. Okay. So throughout the evening hours of May 31st, June 1st, whites will make drive-by shootings down Black residential neighborhoods, in cars, firing into houses on the way. There are some people on the edges of the community who are murdered. There was an elderly Black couple who were saying their prayers when whites broke into their home, put pistols to the back of their heads and blew their brains out. There are a few fires, but what really happens is that African Americans are able to repulse any early invasion attempts of the Black business district, Greenwood. But that gave whites the time to organize. So during those evening hours, white men will show up in bars and all-night cafes and say, we're all going to gather at such and such an intersection to get ready. They plan a dawn invasion. So what happens is shortly before dawn on June 1st, there are thousands of whites. We don't know how many, 3,000, 5,000, all gathered, all armed, including women and boys, and they're poised to invade the Black district. Some African Americans have already left. Others are determined to stay and protect their property. A siren goes off. We're not sure what the siren is from, like a factory work whistle. At that point, whites start invading the Black district. There was a machine gun stolen from the American Legion post, which is put on a grain elevator looking down into the Black district. That opens fire. And what happens basically over the next several hours is a pattern of destruction. So any African Americans who resist are killed. And there are Blacks who fight back and quite actively, but they are eventually overwhelmed. Whites will then, and with the help of the white National Guard and the white Tulsa police, Blacks are disarmed or taken away to internment camps where they're going to be held for several days under armed guards. Whites then, loot buildings, steal what they can, churches, homes, and they go through and they loot and burn the entire community. So by the afternoon, when the National Guard from Oklahoma City finally arrives, more than 1,000 homes and Black African-American homes and businesses have been looted and burned to the ground. North Tulsa looks like Nagasaki or Frankfurt afterwards. There were airplanes in the air as well, too, that whites commandeered. I think that there's strong enough evidence that at least on one of these planes, whites were able to light sticks of dynamite, probably using a cigar or something, and tossed it over there. White National Guard troops ended up, joining in the fight. You had a, beautiful brand new brick church that was attacked by the National Guard as well. A number of atrocities happened. A double amputee African-American pencil salesman was caught by some white youth downtown and dragged to death behind an automobile, and on and on and on. We do not know to this day how many people died. I would say that reasonable estimates, and I've been writing and studying this for 45 years, go from probably 80 to 300, but we really just do not know. That's because martial law was declared and whatnot. And we know that burials were happening during the period of martial law when the city's Black population was all held under armed guard, and their loved ones are getting buried in unmarked graves and without any record keeping at all. In the aftermath, I'll close. Blacks, of course, were blamed for the riot. No whites ever spent a single day in jail for the attempt as well. There was so much money in Tulsa that Black Tulsa did eventually rebuild itself. It took decades for the churches, but the community did rebuild. But there was also a very active cover-up that lasted for more than 50 years in town. Records disappeared. Newspapers, history books and whatnot all went out of their way to mention this. There was a Jewish sociologist in Tulsa who had her job threatened for bringing it up in a university classroom in the 1940s. In the early 1970s, a white researcher had his life threatened for daring to write an article, trying to write an article about the massacre that neither the white newspapers would publish nor would any local magazines. So since then, there has been a long process of uncovering this story. It's taken a long time and a lot of people. There's also been an active search for the graves of the disappeared. I initiated this 20 years ago during the era of the Riot Commission. I had a lot of help. We interviewed more than 300 Tulsans, white and black, identified 3 areas in town where we are confident that massacre victims are buried in unmarked graves. This was that first effort was, and involved forensic anthropologists, a state archaeologist, state medical examiner, lots of people. We got caught up in politics. We were shut down. And then 2 years ago, the white Republican mayor of Tulsa asked me to restart this search, which we have. In July, we did an excavation at Oaklawn Cemetery, a city-owned cemetery where 20 years ago, we found funeral home records that proved that identified and unidentified African-American riot victims were buried in the cemetery. We came up empty in July, but in October, we discovered 12 coffins in an unmarked area where we believe that massacre victims were buried. The hope is to go back this spring to exhume these coffins, hopefully to use DNA and other techniques to see if we can identify who these people are, and then to rebury them with honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ellsworth. Extremely powerful, both of these presentations. I don't need to say it. What I would like to do now is I'd like to spend the rest of our time in 2 ways. The idea I had in bringing Scott and Elissa together today was to think about the deeper structural connection, perhaps, between these 2 moments in history. The simultaneity of the post-World War I period in these really kind of unheard of paroxysms of violence in both societies, right, seems to suggest that there is a larger, deeper connection, even worldwide. So what I wanted to do in our discussion was try to think about, what exactly do we think of that underlying nature of this sort of violence? And the way I'd like to start that is by really kind of starting from the end with a question of memory, right? What both of these incidents seem to show is both on the one hand, the rupture in the society creates an incentive to bury, forget, erase, right? That is often reinforced by the larger political structure. So I'm curious to both of you, what do you make, or how do you understand in each of your instances what the impact of this kind of forgetting and erasure has been in thinking about this kind of violence?
Should I jump in? Should I start?
Please.
Okay, that's a fascinating question. That is a question that I've been thinking a lot about. Is trying to move away from my my narrow Eastern European focus and kind of seeing what is the lesson that can be learned by looking at the events that I look at in order to better understand racism and anti-Semitism today. And I just want to dwell actually on the role of the state, the role that the state has in terms of helping preserve the memory or helping promote oblivion. So the state that has a monopoly over violence, right? It can restrain the violence, it can encourage the violence, it can decriminalize the violence, but it also regulates the memories of violence, sanctioning and circumscribing the contours of the official narratives. So in a way, just to go back to my own, and what I just said applies to racism today in this country, I think. But if I apply what I just said to the context of Ukraine in 1919, Ukraine, what happened to the memory of this genocidal violence? I mean, of course, it's overshadowed by the Holocaust, but it's not only that. The Soviet state played a very important role in helping us forget, this kind of violence that targeted Jews. It was not in the interest of the state to remember, to promote, the memory of this violence, because of the very politicized context of Soviet society. It was a problem that, from a political vantage point, workers and peasants were killing Jewish workers and peasants. It was impossible to apply onto this violence a Marxist reading of the events, right? So little by little, the state is very much interested in forgetting this kind of violence. The violence is preserved by Jews themselves. This violence will play a major role in the interwar period in the collective memory of Jews. Why do we know so little about it? Because these are the Jews who were killed during the Holocaust so successfully, right? When the Germans come in, the first Jews to be killed are those same Jews who experience this kind of violence. So, the question of memory, and for example, there are so many memorials that mark instances of massacres of Jews. One of them that I studied very closely is in the region of Vinnytsia in Ukraine. There's this huge memorial that, I have photographs of it in my book. And it was not destroyed by the Germans. It's still standing there. It was a problem, though, for the neighbors, because it reminded them of neighbors killing neighbors, right? Because these pogroms are different, not only because they are carried out in a military context, they are, these are military pogroms, but it's also, they grow out of the reality of neighbors killing neighbors. And just to connect to what Scott so vividly, depicted, they do grow out of, the socioeconomic tensions, the fact that Jews, in this new context are showing off their political agency, or showing off their, it's not only about socioeconomic visibility, it's really also about political agency. So I think I'll leave it. I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I won't offer a sort of a theoretical view, but I will give you some more details on what happened in Tulsa. So, the White City Fathers realized, what's now called the massacre, then known as the riot. This was front page news in the New York Times, the Times of London. This was a big event. And the White City Fathers realized they had a big PR problem. And because the martial law declared, train service interrupted and all of that. And they determined very quickly that we need to get this out of the news and get it out behind us. And what they did was they announced to the world that White Tulsa was ashamed of this. They'd rebuild the Black community. They didn't. Instead, they tried to steal the land where the Black commercial district was to build a new train station. They refused aid from from offers of aid from all over the country. And they also, it just disappeared. We have evidence that the police chief sent his police officers out to collect, go to all the photo studios in town and get any negatives and photographs of riot dead and the rioting and all that stuff. But the newspapers went out of their way to not mention it. The Tribune, who really launches this event, they had a figure in their op-ed page called "What Happened in Tulsa 15 years ago and 20 years ago." And when they would get to the riot, the anniversary of the riot, somehow they found something else to write. They would write, Miss Caroline Skelly had her debutante ball and all the bridesmaids wore, whatever, pink and green, and so I mentioned this Jewish sociologist named Nancy Goodman Feldman, who was from Chicago. She knew about the 1919 Chicago riot. She falls in love with a GI from Tulsa. She moves to Tulsa right at the end of the war, tries to get a job as a lawyer, cannot. She ends up teaching sociology, which she didn't know anything about it. the University of Tulsa, small, all-white school. And she was into recreation. She had met an African-American recreation employee who was a massacre survivor named Robert Fairchild. And he told her about the riot. And she was shocked and asked her in-laws, who had admitted it had happened. And so she tells her students about it in class. And they all said, nothing like that ever happened here. You know, what are you talking about? This is 25 years later. These are all white students who are from Tulsa. They never heard of this thing. And so she brings in, Fairchild to speak. He speaks to the class. Her dean catches wind of it and threatens him to fire her if she ever does that again. But she said the horror for her, this is only one generation after the riot, and the memory has already been erased, okay? What's interesting, though, is that in the African-American community, with some exceptions, many of the survivors didn't want to talk about it either. I suspect this is true in the community of Holocaust survivors, certainly of World War II vets that I was all raised by. So you had people who were my age who didn't learn about the massacre until 20 years ago. This was a burden they didn't want to do. On the 25th anniversary of the riot, the Oklahoma Eagle, which the Black Tulsa's new newspaper, had exactly one sentence about it buried in an editorial. So the clamping down of this history was very much intentional in the white community, involved threats and a culture of silence, but in the Black community, it existed as well.
If I can just jump in very quickly, that is fascinating, Scott, because that's the same, I did not mention it, but it's the same that, the same phenomenon that we see in the Jewish context, whether it is in the, in the aftermath of these pogroms or in the Holocaust. I mean, oblivion is a response, forgetting is a response to trauma. We tend to say, oh, why are they forgetting these communities? But of course, I mean, it is a legitimate and very widespread response to trauma.
It is, repression is very strong, very strong mechanism. I just want to sort of piggyback on that, if you don't mind, for a moment. Just what really strikes me are a couple of things. First of all, the idea of the victims being victimized because of their agency, right, seems to be a common thread in both instances, right? You have, men coming back from Europe, having been in combat, having experienced that, coming back as, rightfully expecting to be able to conduct their lives. You have a similar instance in Russia and Ukraine with the, as Elissa sort of pointed out very eloquently, you do have an instance where the Bolsheviks begin to offer a level of kind of assistance or protection on on some level, right, that allows Jews to kind of take positions that had been denied them, right? That in a sense there's a the act of the minority declaring their agency seems to be a powerful incentive in both of these instances. And then just one other comment, the ritualization of the violence seems to be very noteworthy, right? Scott, when you spoke about the really almost an anniversary reenactment of a previous lynching as being so in the thinking that the newspaper is putting out the evening edition in what seems to have been something that was understood as the signal that it was, right? So which speaks to a deeper kind of cultural element of violence, which I have, being more of an expert in Eastern Europe, I do see that especially Central Europe is really my area of expertise. Right? You do see that sort of like process of ritual becoming an important element in all of this. But before, I'm not going to say anything else. I would like to say we're getting towards the end of the hour, and what I wanted to do is open up the floor a little bit for a few questions. We've had a few questions come into the chat. So Elissa and Scott, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask a couple of these questions. The first one I really want to ask because it's of great interest to me as well, is what is your assessment? This is one of our participants, Professor Josh Shanes. What is your assessment of the Watchmen reproduction and whether you would recommend it for teaching of the Tulsa event?
Well, I have to be honest with you. I only watched the first episode, and this has been a very long process of getting this story out. So when my book Death in the Promised Land came out in 1982, when I was a graduate student at Duke, it's been in print since then. There was one op-ed in the Washington Post about the book, but that was the only national story about, that was the first national story about the riot since the 1920s. Okay. In, we had, well, I can tell a long story. Beginning in the 1990s, we started to get some traction, and we've continued to try to get this story out. It's still not in virtually most U.S. history textbooks. The massacre doesn't show up. It's still kind of an orphan out there. But I will tell you this: The Watchman has done a great deal in terms of spreading this story, particularly for a younger generation. It's spread it all over the world. One of my goals has been to get this story out. I think it's an important story that the country needs to hear, and certainly my hometown did, and the world. So I no, there's some stuff they do great in the one scene I saw. There's some stuff that's ridiculous. Klansmen and Klan uniforms walking through the community, things like that simply did not happen. There's a lot of good stuff that's out there that can be used for teaching, and there's a lot to come. LeBron James's motion picture production company, Spring Hill, is doing a documentary. The History Channel's doing a new documentary. The LeBron James one will air on CNN. There's a lot that's going to come out between now and the centennial in May, and of course I've got a new book about it as well.
Another question from our audience, and I think it's kind of an interesting one, right? At what point do you think, right, in your experience, in your research, both Elissa and Scott, what point do you find that the victimizer realizes that what they've done is wrong, right? At what point in the kind of, unfolding of the thinking that, I mean, what do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a, can I start?
Do they ever think they're wrong?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, the perpetrators of pogrom violence, in my case, are using the pogrom as a convenient instrument to punish and terrorize Jewish communities, right? They do it also because it is, in a way, culturally acceptable. And I think this is connected to what you were saying, Jess, about how ritualized this violence is. It is culturally acceptable to, whenever I am angry at the Jews for any reason, because they killed Jesus, blood libel, because of, political agency, socioeconomic breakdown of relationship between Jews and non-Jews, I am entitled to organize a pogrom against them, especially in the context of Tsarist Russia, 19th century, when anti-Semitism, both socially and from above, was endemic. So there is that, they're acting on the fact that this is culturally acceptable. I think the realization of, if the perpetrator realizes that he or she, because women, as Scott mentioned, are also, participate in the violence, has done something wrong, depends on the context, depends on the state authorities, local authorities, regional authorities, it really depends on the extent to which they are able to empathize. But as long as this violence is culturally acceptable, I think it is very difficult to empathize, to feel, the pain of those who were targeted for violence.
I don't have much to add, but here's some evidence that would give you can lead to your own conclusion. After the massacre, Tulsa became a gigantic Klan center. Of course, the massacre is being portrayed as an African-American uprising that blacks were going to attack white neighborhoods, all that stuff. But Tulsa, the Klan in Tulsa built their own, massive brick hall known as Beano Hall locally for be no black person, be no Jewish person, be no They had a women's auxiliary of the Klan, and Tulsa was one of the few cities in the nation where they had a chapter of children of the Ku Klux Klan as well. So this was a great explosion there. So I think in the basis of that evidence, I don't think there was very much remorse.
A question from Rabbi Berman. Was there any distinctive response, this is Professor Ellsworth, was there any distinctive response to the massacre from the religious leadership in Tulsa?
Well, there was I'll tell you a brief story. I went to I'm a Presbyterian. Grew up in First Presbyterian Church in Tulsa, a big downtown flagship, very important church. When the lynch mob had gathered, our minister, Reverend Kerr, for the church, went and tried to get the lynch mob to go home, and they shot him down. And during the massacre or after the massacre, the church sheltered some African Americans in the basement of the church. Okay. And they've been very, very proud of that, my church, for decades. They always bring it up in their histories, how they did this and how valiant we were for that. What they don't mention is that about 4 days after the riot, they ran an advertisement in Tulsa's white daily newspapers telling people that the church had been fumigated, which is the idea that now that we've cleaned things that black people have touched, you can come back and worship. So, the reality is, I started doing interviews in the 1970s. Whites would not talk about this at all. I would say only in the last 5 years will you find some white families whose grandparents were involved in this, who find this shameful, who will now talk about that connection. But the religious community, no, I don't think there was a particularly strong response in any way. And all the black churches were burned, incidentally.
So we are kind of getting towards the end of the hour. And I was wondering if I might indulge both of our guests just for another couple of minutes. I don't know if you have to rush off. I was hoping that we might be able to open up the floor and have everybody unmuted for any. I've seen some very interesting comments, not necessarily questions, but comments coming out in the chat. So I would love it if anybody who does have a comment or question could bring that up. Ronnie, are you able to unmute everybody?
No, I think people have to do it themselves.
Oh, just unmute yourself, please. And please, some of the comments seem very interesting. I'd rather have the speakers speak themselves.
Yeah, totally.
Could I say something as another resident Oklahoman? The thing about Oklahoma is that talking about the ritualization of violence, the ritualization of violence in Oklahoma precedes 1921 by, hundreds of years in terms of Native Americans. So the whole history of the state is blood-soaked as far as I'm concerned, which is just heartbreaking, appalling, embarrassing, shameful, terrible. I don't even know how to respond. I'm just shocked constantly by this ongoing story.
It seems as though, Lauren, that you actually had, your own personal experience of this erasure in your own education.
Completely. I took 1 year of Oklahoma history in high school. It was so, I thought, thorough. We read primary documents. The teacher was wonderful. I just had a sense that I knew everything about the history of the state. And I knew maybe 60% of the history of the state. And that was state mandated, right? That was something public school, that was the state curriculum. So somebody asked before, why cover it up? Because it's too messy, because it's too much of a bother. It acknowledges a presence of people who Oklahoma doesn't want to identify with, or white Oklahoma, I should say.
Could I ask Scott another question?
Yes, oh, absolutely. Saul, I do have to, Reverend Berman, I do have to say, I don't, there may be people that I've missed that I don't know about, who spoke out against this, but I don't have any evidence of a huge organized response.
Okay, so as this story becomes more commonly known, and presumably at some point it will come even to be taught in the schools as part of the history of Tulsa, what would you expect the community, or what would you hope the community would do in recognition of the fact that all of this has occurred? I mean, I think that the whole country now is struggling with the question of, so should there be reparations? Should there be some acknowledgement, some form of ritualized even acknowledgements and apologies and right? So what would you see as a reasonable way to expect the community of Tulsa on this smaller scale to respond to the reality of what occurred, almost 100 years ago?
Well, I have a few ideas on that. Very briefly, I first think that the National Park Service needs to come in, and they need to be the group that's going to oversee the memorialization of both the Greenwood community and of the massacre itself. They do an excellent job. They do an excellent job at the Battle of Little Bighorn, a lot of places that are historically contentious. That needs to happen. If we have indeed found massacre victims, they need to be reburied in a substantial memorial of honor, something that might be and would become a national shrine for African Americans murdered and buried in unknown graves across the country. The issue of reparations, initially 20 years ago, I was not overly enthused about reparations. I really thought that my town and by extension, the country needed to grapple with this event and deal with that and figure out how to create a new history that recognizes that. The survivors that were still around in the 1990s convinced me otherwise, that they needed to have reparations. I supported it. We failed. The state gave all, some 100 survivors a gold-plated medal with their name on it, hanging by a red, white, and blue ribbon. No money was paid to them. There was an attempt at a lawsuit that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court would not hear it. There is an attempt now, a second lawsuit to win reparations, really for the descendants of survivors, because there might be one or two survivors left. I'm open to, I think that, the opportunity should have happened in the 1990s to pay reparations to the survivors that were there. And as a result, I support it for the descendants in this case.
As long as we don't look to independent Ukraine as a role model, right? Because the pogroms that I study are completely erased, completely in the Ukrainian context. There's nothing in the textbooks. There is, no memory. And quite to the contrary, those who are responsible for the killing are heeded as the heroes of in the Ukrainian context, like Simon Petlura.
Is that true of the younger generation in Hungary, in the Ukraine as well?
Yes. I mean, with the exception of young scholars and people who are involved in seriously studying the history of Ukraine. And so there's this center in Lviv for the study of urban history that is very much, kind of trying to spread, trying to make this story available. But generally speaking, if we think about, popular memory, this history is completely erased.
Is there any difference in your observation between the two parts of Ukraine, the part that was now annexed by the by Russia and the part that was not? Are those two sort of culturally distinctive components, and is there a difference between the way they've reacted?
That's an excellent question, Rabbi Berman. I mean, if we consider Ukraine today, there probably is, well, that it's actually very complicated. I think that the memory of World War II plays a major role. And in World War II, in Western Ukraine especially, this memory of Jews connected to Judeo-Bolshevism, which is, more kind of widespread in Western Ukraine, has led to the erasure, has made the erasure more something that makes sense, of course. And this goes back to Josh Shane's, to Ronnie's question about the victimizer. There's no empathy here. They were murderers. They were Judeo-Bolsheviks, and so I think there is a difference actually between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. Yes.
It's Rabbi Blau. It seemed as though you might have wanted to ask a question. And then we should probably wrap it up, but Rabbi Blau, please. Rabbi Blau, I'm sorry, you're muted.
I just wanted to ask both of you if you have any records of people who objected, both in Tulsa and in Eastern Europe. Was there some element? You asked before about the churches in Tulsa. What about the churches in the Ukraine and in Poland?
Well, I can speak with Tulsa. There were, certainly some instances of heroism. We know about. There was a white couple that lived on the outskirts of town, and African Americans would travel almost at night to try to get out of the area or to go to safe places. And this particular white couple put them up in their basement for days. Just Black people knew that this was a place they could stay safely during the day and showed up. We have Native American and Latinx people who sheltered African American children who were scared what would happen to them. There were certainly, people along the lines. And to go back just a little bit to what Rabbi Berman said, I mean, there's been no question that Tulsa had lost its sense of honesty for 50 years. And it's been this process, and it's been a difficult process for a lot of people in the white community to come to terms with this. Many people didn't know anything about it, trying to figure out what it is. But, I've seen, I have witnessed a slow but steady sea change in attitudes towards this and attitudes as to what should be done about this. We're living in this great age of reevaluation, who's going to be championed, who isn't. I'm a graduate of Robert E. Lee Elementary School. I played shortstops for the Lee Generals. Well, my school name has now been changed in Tulsa. So, we're in an area where a lot of stuff is happening, and we just happen to be a little ahead of y'all in terms of trying to cope with some of that.
Just very briefly, yes, there were, of course, instances of neighbors coming to the rescue. And now, since we are going over time, I will just mention this very powerful instance of a woman who I study closely. I bring in her voice in my book, who fled the region of Odessa. She fled with her newborn son, or he was about 3 or 4 months old. And it was a neighbor who came to the rescue, a Ukrainian woman who gave her, so that she could, hide her identity, gave her, a traditional Ukrainian dress, and gave her a little cross so that she could put the cross, the necklace with the cross around the neck of her son, so that he would not be killed. This is in 1919, again, when the violence reaches its peak. And thanks to this, to the help that came from a neighbor, she was able to flee to Romania, and then eventually to Palestine, where she became a well-known writer.
Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap things up this afternoon. This has been, to my mind, a really illuminating and I think very important discussion. And I'm very grateful for all of you who took time to attend. I am particularly grateful to my colleagues, Scott Ellsworth and Elissa Bemporad, for taking the time to prepare such very powerful material to share with us. I also want to just put a little plug in here. If this is the kind of discussion that is of interest to you, we will be having more of them. This is the first in a series of discussions as a subpart of the Crisis and Hope series, where we will be discussing issues of race and conflict as part of a course that I will be teaching in the spring in the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies on Blacks and Jews in America. I put that out there. If you are affiliated with YU and would like to take the course, if you're not affiliated with YU and would like to take the course, please feel free to look into signing up. I would be very happy to have any of you here. So once again, thanks to Scott Ellsworth, thanks to Elissa Bemporad. Crisis and Hope is a project of the Center for Israel Studies at Yeshiva University and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs and Judaic Studies at YU Mad'ai HaYahadut. Thank you, and please check our earlier offerings at www.yu.edu/crisisandhope, one word. And if you'd like to access the recordings directly, it is yu.edu/crisisandhope-past recordings. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Buddy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.